Oprah Winfrey interview in her Netflix series, Harry and Meghan. Now, Meghan is fiercely fighting to have this case tossed, hoping that the judge will dismiss it without a trial.
Prince Harry entered London's High Court to battle the tabloids, but within hours the fight became painfully personal. Prince Harry walked into London's High Court on January 21, 2026.
Morning, sir. Morning, Harry. Morning, Harry.
Expecting another routine day in his ongoing battle against the Daily Mail. He'd been fighting this lawsuit for years alongside celebrities like Elton John and Elizabeth Hurley, all of them claiming associated newspapers had invaded their privacy through unlawful information gathering. Harry had given emotional testimony just hours earlier, telling the court how the tabloids had made Meghan's life an absolute misery. His voice broke when he talked about the relentless media coverage, the constant invasion of privacy, the way photographers had hounded them from the moment their relationship became public. The courtroom had seen him vulnerable before, but nothing prepared anyone for what came next. Judge Timothy Fancourt asked for a brief recess to review new evidence that had just been submitted by Associated Newspaper's legal team. Harry's lawyers looked confused. They hadn't been told about any new evidence. When the court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely changed. The evidence came from an unexpected source. Jason Knauf, the former communications secretary who had worked for both the Cambridges and the Sussexes at Kensington Palace, had provided a sworn statement to the court along with a collection of emails, text messages, and private communications dating back to 2018. Knauf had been the person caught in the middle when Harry and William's relationship started falling apart. He was the man who sent that infamous email in October 2018 raising concerns about Meghan's treatment of palace staff. Two assistants had left their positions, and Knauf wrote to William's private secretary saying he was very concerned that the Duchess had been able to bully them out of the household. That email had leaked to the media right before the Oprah interview in March 2021, leading many to believe it was a coordinated attack on Meghan by the palace to undermine her credibility before she could tell her story. Meghan and Harry had always maintained that the bullying allegations were false and part of a smear campaign orchestrated by people within the institution who wanted to destroy her reputation. But Knauf's new submission to the court wasn't about bullying allegations. It was about something far more calculated. The documents showed a side of Meghan that contradicted everything she and Harry had said publicly about their relationship, their departure from royal life, and their treatment by both the media and the royal family. Judge Fancourt began reading selected excerpts aloud, his voice measured and clinical as he laid out what the evidence contained. The courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence as the implications became clear. These weren't just casual conversations between Meghan and her former aide. They were strategic discussions about media management, public perception, and how to control narratives about the royal family. One email from December 2018 showed Meghan providing Knauf with detailed briefing points to share with Omid Scobie and Carolyn Durand, the authors of Finding Freedom, the biography about Harry and Meghan that was published in August 2020. Finding Freedom had always been controversial, painting a flattering picture of Harry and Meghan while casting William and Kate negatively. Harry and Meghan's lawyers had repeatedly stated they did not collaborate with the authors. But Knauf's emails showed Meghan had authorized specific cooperation in December 2018, sending him briefing points including details about her wedding tiara and her father, Thomas Markle. Knauf had advised against putting the authors in direct contact with Meghan's friends, telling Harry that being able to say hand on heart that they didn't facilitate access would be important. Harry had replied saying he totally agreed they had to be able to say they didn't have anything to do with it, but that Knauf giving the right context and background would help get some truths out there. The email exchange revealed that both Harry and Meghan knew their former aide was briefing the Finding Freedom authors with information they provided, despite their later claims in court that they had no involvement. When this evidence first came to light in November 2021 during Meghan's separate privacy lawsuit against the Mail on Sunday over the publication of her letter to her father, Meghan had apologized to the court. She said she had forgotten about the emails with Knauf and accepted that she had provided some information for the book. The court had moved on, and Meghan eventually won that case. But what Judge Fancourt was reading aloud in January 2026 went much further than the 2021 revelations. Associated newspapers had conducted additional discovery and found more communications between Meghan and Knopf that painted a troubling picture of long-term planning and media manipulation. One email from early 2019 discussed how to maximize sympathy for Meghan by timing the release of certain personal stories. Another message talked about which members of the royal family could be used as contrast points to make Harry and Meghan look more modern and progressive. There was a detailed breakdown of Thomas Markle's vulnerabilities and how those could be used to explain why Meghan had cut off contact with him. Judge Fancourt read from a message Meghan had sent to Knopf in March 2019, just weeks after she and Harry had completed their final round of royal engagements before officially stepping back. The message talked about maintaining public interest in their story by carefully managing what information became public and when. Meghan wrote that they needed to make sure certain narratives stayed in the press to keep public sympathy on their side during the transition period. She mentioned Harry's relationship with William needed to remain a talking point because the broken brotherhood angle generated significant media coverage. The judge continued reading, and the next part made several people gasp. Meghan had written that Harry's trauma about his mother's death was their most valuable asset in terms of public sympathy, and they needed to be strategic about when and how Harry discussed Diana. The message laid out a timeline for Harry's public grieving, suggesting spacing out his emotional revelations would maximize their impact. The Oprah interview would be the perfect opportunity for Harry to compare how Diana was treated with how Meghan was being treated. Harry would need to be emotional, but not hysterical. The goal was to make the public see Meghan as Diana's spiritual successor. Harry's face went completely white as the judge read these words aloud. His hands, which had been resting on the table in front of him, slowly curled into fists. His jaw tightened to the point where you could see the muscles flexing under his skin. He looked like someone had physically struck him, the kind of blow that doesn't just hurt your body but reaches inside and tears something essential away from you. His lawyer immediately stood and requested a recess, arguing that Harry was experiencing severe emotional distress and needed time to process what he was hearing. Judge Fancourt denied the request, stating that the presentation of evidence needed to continue uninterrupted. The court had strict scheduling requirements, and they were already behind because of the late submission of these materials. Harry sat there frozen while the judge kept reading. Another message discussed the Netflix deal that Harry and Meghan had signed with their production company, Archewell, in 2020. The original deal had been worth a reported $100 million, giving Netflix exclusive rights to all content produced by Archewell. Meghan's message to Knopf, sent months before the deal was publicly announced, and talked about how they needed to structure their royal exit in a way that would make them more valuable to streaming platforms and production companies. She wrote that leaving with maximum drama and controversy would actually increase their market value because it created a story people worldwide wanted to hear. The key was being seen as victims rather than quitters. If they positioned themselves as people forced out by an archaic, possibly racist institution, they would have a built-in audience. Meghan mentioned Harry's military service and Invictus Games work gave them credibility, and combining his veteran status with their narrative would make them attractive to American audiences. The message went on to discuss how they should handle the situation with Archie's title. She wrote that they needed to imply that the palace had refused to give Archie a title because of racism, even though they knew the actual reason was that under royal protocol, Archie wouldn't automatically become a prince until Charles became king. The truth was complicated and involved rules that had been set by King George V in 1917, but the public wouldn't understand those details. It would be much more effective to let people assume that Archie was being treated differently than William's children because of the color of his skin. That narrative would generate sympathy and outrage, both of which would be useful when they started doing interviews and producing content about their experiences. Judge Fancourt paused after reading this section, allowing the weight of it to sink in. Harry looked like he might be sick. His face had gone from white to a grayish color, and he was breathing in short, shallow gasps. One of his security team members moved slightly closer, ready to step in if Harry collapsed or needed medical attention. The judge asked Harry directly if he needed a break. Harry shook his head, but he didn't speak. He just sat there staring at the table in front of him, his eyes unfocused, like he was looking at something very far away that only he could see. The evidence continued. More emails showed Meghan coordinating with Knopf about which stories to plant in the media and which ones to deny. There were discussions about timing the revelation of Meghan's miscarriage, which she later wrote about in a November 2020 New York Times essay titled "The Losses We Share." The essay had been deeply personal and moving, describing how she had a miscarriage in July 2020 while holding Archie and how the loss had devastated both her and Harry. But the emails showed that Meghan had been planning to write about the miscarriage for months before the essay was published, and she had discussed with Knopf how to frame it in a way that would generate maximum sympathy, while also allowing her to criticize the British press for their role in creating the stress that she believed contributed to the pregnancy loss.
In celebrating the 125th anniversary of women's suffrage in your country.
Meghan had written to Knopf that American audiences would respond well because it humanized her while reinforcing the narrative that the British media had treated her cruelly. The Oprah interview from March 2021 came up repeatedly in the evidence. Messages showed that Meghan had been planning that interview for months, carefully deciding which revelations to save for that platform and which ones to hold back for other opportunities. There were notes about what Harry should and shouldn't say, suggestions for how emotional he should appear when discussing different topics, and detailed discussions about which members of the royal family they should criticize directly and which ones they should handle more carefully. One message talked about how they needed to be cautious about criticizing the Queen directly because she was too beloved, but that Charles and William were fair targets because public perception of them was more mixed. Meghan wrote that Camilla was perfect to use as a villain because many people still hadn't forgiven her for her role in Charles and Diana's marriage breakdown. If they could subtly link Camilla to the negative treatment Meghan had experienced, it would resonate with people who remembered the Diana years. The judge read a message about Harry's therapy sessions and mental health struggles. Meghan had written to Knopf about how Harry's openness about his mental health could be leveraged for both public sympathy and for content creation. She specifically mentioned that Harry's discussion of his mother's death, his time in Afghanistan, and his struggles with feeling trapped in the royal system would make compelling documentary material. She wrote they should encourage Harry to be open about his mental health.
I think you feel really confident that it was divinely ordered. Maybe all of this, our friendship, you becoming our...
Because vulnerability was good for their brand, but they needed to be careful not to let him appear too damaged or unstable. Harry needed to seem wounded, but healing, hurt by his past, but optimistic about his future with Meghan. There were discussions about their children, Archie and Lilibet, and how to use them in media appearances and content creation. Meghan wrote that they should keep the children mostly private, but release strategic photos and information at key moments to maintain public interest. Photos around birthdays or holidays would generate positive press and remind people why they left the royal family. But they needed to make sure the children remained valuable from a content perspective. The goal was controlled access that made people hungry for more, while positioning them as protective parents. The evidence also covered the couple's relationship with the rest of the royal family after they moved to California. Messages showed Meghan discussing how to handle communication with Charles, William, and Kate in a way that would allow them to maintain some connection for Harry's sake, while also preserving their ability to criticize the institution publicly. She wrote they needed to distinguish between the royal family as individuals and as an institution. They could claim to love Charles, William, and Kate as people while attacking the system they represented. That way, they could avoid accusations of being cruel while maintaining their victim narrative. The strategy was to make it seem like they'd been rebuffed by the palace, when actually Meghan was orchestrating some of the distance. Judge Fancourt finally finished reading from the evidence submission, and the courtroom sat in stunned silence. Harry hadn't moved in over an hour. He was still sitting in the same position.
To do some form of therapy, or at least be able to talk more about.
Hands on the table, eyes staring at nothing, barely breathing. When his lawyer approached him and put a hand on his shoulder, Harry flinched like he'd forgotten where he was. The lawyer whispered something to him, and Harry slowly shook his head. He didn't want to leave. He wanted to hear the rest. Associated Newspaper's legal team stood and addressed the judge, arguing that this evidence fundamentally changed the nature of the case. Harry and Meghan had claimed that the media had invaded their privacy and caused them emotional distress through unlawful information gathering. But this evidence suggested that Meghan had actively courted media attention, planted stories, and manipulated public perception, while simultaneously claiming to be a victim of press intrusion. The lawyers argued you couldn't claim privacy violations when actively feeding information to journalists and treating private life as content to be monetized. Harry's legal team objected, saying this didn't prove anything about the Daily Mail's unlawful behavior or give newspapers the right to use illegal methods. Judge Fancourt said he would need time to review all the evidence and determine what impact, if any, it would have on the case moving forward. He noted that the evidence raised serious questions about credibility and motivation that would need to be carefully considered. The court adjourned for the day, and Harry was led out of the building by his security team, looking like a man who had just watched his entire life collapse in front of him. The media reaction was immediate and brutal. Within hours, every major news outlet in the UK and America was covering the revelations. Headlines screamed about Meghan's manipulation, Harry's betrayal, the calculated nature of everything the Sussexes had said and done since leaving the royal family. Social media went into overdrive, with people who had supported Meghan feeling betrayed and people who had always been skeptical of her claiming vindication. Even some of Meghan and Harry's most loyal defenders struggled to explain away the evidence.
I can safely say from my experience and all the traveling that I've done all over the world.
The messages weren't taken out of context or misinterpreted. They were clear, detailed, and showed a level of strategic planning that contradicted everything the couple had said about their motivations for leaving royal life and speaking out about their experiences. The Oprah interview, which had seemed so raw and emotional when it aired in March 2021, now looked different in light of these revelations. Had Harry really been speaking from the heart, or had Meghan coached him on what to say and how to say it? When Meghan cried during the interview, was it genuine emotion or calculated performance designed to generate sympathy? Royal commentators noted that Harry had seemed genuinely shocked and devastated by the evidence presented in court, suggesting that he may not have been aware of the extent of Meghan's strategic communications with Jason Knopf. If Harry didn't know about these messages, it meant his wife had been planning and executing a sophisticated media strategy without his full knowledge or consent, using his trauma, his family relationships, and his mental health struggles as tools to advance their brand and financial interests. That possibility was almost worse than if Harry had been a willing participant, because it meant he was being used by the person he trusted most in the world. In the days following the court appearance, sources close to the royal family began speaking to the media, though all of them remained anonymous. They said that King Charles was deeply saddened by the revelations, but not entirely surprised. Charles had suspected for years that Meghan was driving much of the couple's decision-making and media strategy, but he had hoped that Harry would eventually see through it and come back to the family. Prince William was reportedly furious, feeling vindicated in his early concerns about Meghan, but also angry at Harry for allowing himself to be manipulated so completely. The source said William had warned Harry before the wedding that Meghan was moving too fast, and that Harry should slow down and really get to know her before making such a huge commitment. Harry had accused William of being snobbish and unsupportive, which had been one of the first major fractures in their relationship. Now it seemed William had been right to be cautious. Kate was said to be focused on the children and on supporting William through his complicated feelings about his brother. She had always been the peacemaker between William and Harry, but even she couldn't see a path forward now. The evidence had shown that Meghan had specifically targeted Kate in her strategic planning, using her as a contrast point and encouraging media narratives that painted Kate as cold and unwelcoming.
It is this texture, the weave of love, which forms a child's emotional world.
That level of calculation was hard to forgive, especially when Kate had genuinely tried to help Meghan adjust to royal life in the early days. Harry remained in London for 3 more days after the court appearance, staying at a hotel rather than with family. He met with his lawyers multiple times, presumably discussing how to handle the fallout and what it meant for the ongoing case against associated newspapers. There were reports that Harry also spoke with his father during this time, though Buckingham Palace refused to confirm or deny any private meetings. Sources suggested that Charles had reached out to Harry, offering support and a safe space to talk without judgment or media attention. Charles had always loved his younger son deeply, and despite everything that had happened over the past few years, he wanted Harry to know that the door was still open if Harry wanted to come home. But coming home would mean leaving Meghan, or at least confronting her about what she'd done. It would mean admitting he'd been wrong about so many things, that he'd damaged his relationship with William based on a version of events Meghan had constructed. It would mean accepting that the woman he loved had been using him as a tool to build her brand without caring about the cost to his family relationships. Harry flew back to California on January 24, 2026, and was photographed arriving at the Montecito home he shares with Meghan and their 2 children. He looked exhausted and much older than his 41 years, his face drawn and his shoulders slumped as he walked from the car to the house. Meghan was not seen, and the couple released no statement addressing the evidence that had been presented in court. Their lawyers issued a brief comment saying that private communications were being misrepresented and that Meghan had every right to work with her employee on communication strategy as long as she wasn't breaking any laws. They said the evidence didn't change the fundamental facts of the case against Associated Newspapers, which was about unlawful information gathering by the newspaper, not about Meghan's private conversations with Jason Knauf. But the damage was done. Public opinion, which had been slowly turning against the Sussexes over the past couple of years, now shifted decisively.
And one of the places that I went to very early on was SmartWorks. Now,
even people who had been sympathetic to Meghan's complaints about racism and media intrusion had trouble defending what the evidence showed. The Netflix deal that had been extended just months earlier in August 2025 was now under renewed scrutiny. Netflix had announced a multi-year first-look deal with Archewell Productions, giving the streaming giant first option on any projects Harry and Meghan wanted to produce. The deal was believed to be less lucrative than their original 2020 agreement, with Netflix now having the ability to pass on projects rather than being obligated to fund everything Archewell proposed. But even this scaled-back arrangement was being questioned by media analysts, who wondered if Netflix would want to continue associating with the Sussexes given the revelations about how Meghan had strategically planned their entire post-royal narrative. The Harry and Meghan documentary that premiered on Netflix in December 2022 had gotten 23.4 million views in its first 4 days. Now it looked less like a genuine attempt to share their truth and more like carefully crafted content designed to generate sympathy and revenue. PR experts said Meghan would need to address the evidence directly to salvage her reputation. Staying silent wouldn't work. She would need to either admit she'd been strategic and explain why, or provide context that made the messages seem less calculated. But any statement would be viewed with skepticism.
She was using her position as Princess of Wales, the most famous woman in the world.
The situation with Harry was even more complicated. If the evidence was accurate and Harry truly didn't know about the extent of Meghan's planning and manipulation, then he was as much a victim as anyone else. He had trusted his wife, shared his deepest traumas with her, and believed that they were building a new life together based on honesty and authenticity. Instead, she'd been treating his pain and family relationships as assets to be exploited. Friends of Harry, speaking anonymously, told reporters he was devastated and questioning everything about his marriage. One source said Harry felt like he'd been living in a fantasy world Meghan had created, where they were the heroes and everyone else was either an enemy or a potential ally. Now that fantasy had shattered, Harry was particularly hurt by evidence showing Meghan had strategically used his relationship with Diana in their media planning. His mother had died when he was just 12, and he'd spent decades processing that trauma. To learn Meghan had viewed his grief as an asset to be leveraged felt like a betrayal of everything sacred. Diana wasn't content or a story angle. She was his mother, and his grief was the most personal thing he carried. Legal experts predicted the evidence would likely result in a settlement rather than going to trial. Associated Newspapers now had significant ammunition, and any trial would involve detailed examination of every strategic communication. The couple's credibility would be completely destroyed. It would be better for everyone to settle quietly, but that would require giving up their fight against the tabloids. something they'd made central to their public identity. What do you think? If this evidence is accurate, does it completely change how you see Harry and Meghan's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the following video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.